You were never an investment, Brooke. You were just a $250,000 clerical error we decided to keep for the tax breaks." Those words didn't just fall out of my father's mouth. They were spat with a precision that only decades of practiced disdain could produce, cutting through the ambient hum of a string quartet playing Vivaldi in the ballroom of the Sterling estate. It was the night of the Sterling family gala, an annual display of generational wealth and carefully curated masks, and I was standing in the center of the marble foyer in front of 42 relatives, all of whom were clutching crystal flutes of vintage 2012 Dom Perignon. My name is Brooke Sterling. I am 34 years old, and for the last 12 years, I have built a career as a senior forensic accountant, a profession dedicated to finding the truth hidden beneath layers of deception and buried in the cold, hard columns of financial ledgers. I have spent my life balancing the books for Fortune 500 companies and untangling the knotted webs of corporate embezzlement, only to find out in one soul-crushing moment that my own life's balance sheet was a forgery, a series of inflated assets and hidden liabilities that had finally come due. But I am getting ahead of myself, and before I show you how the ink ran dry on my family's legacy, let me take you back to the atmosphere of that evening in Greenwich, Connecticut. The Sterling estate is a sprawling 22,000-square-foot colonial revival that smells perpetually of expensive floor wax, cold lilies, and the kind of old money that feels heavy in your lungs. It was a Saturday in mid-October, the kind of crisp New England evening where the air feels like it's vibrating with the promise of winter. I had arrived in my 2024 graphite metallic Audi e-tron GT, a car I bought with my own bonuses, parked precisely between my brother Julian's Porsche 911 and my father's midnight blue Bentley Mulsanne. Even the driveway was a hierarchy of status, a calculated arrangement of leather and horsepower designed to signal exactly who mattered in this family. I remember the exact weight of my clutch bag as I stepped out, a structured black leather piece from Saint Laurent that cost me $3,000, and the way the gravel crunched under my 4-inch Jimmy Choo stilettos. I was wearing a floor-length silk gown in a shade of emerald green that my mother always said made me look too bold, but on that night, I wanted to feel like a fortress. Inside, the gala was in full swing. The catering staff, a team of 12 professionals in crisp white gloves from Silver Spoon Events, moved like ghosts through the crowd, carrying silver trays laden with beluga caviar blinnies and miniature Wagyu beef sliders that cost $45 a bite. My father, Alistair Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Global Logistics, stood by the grand fireplace, his hand resting on the mantel like he owned the very concept of heat. At 65, he still carried the sharp, predatory energy of a man who had never lost a negotiation. Beside him was my mother, Eleanor, looking regal in a custom Oscar de la Renta gown and a diamond necklace that had been appraised for more than my first year's salary at the firm. Then there was Julian, the golden boy, the 37-year-old heir apparent who had been given every lead, every advantage, and every forgiveness, while I was relegated to the margins of the family photo. Julian was currently laughing at a joke made by our uncle, a man who had inherited a shipping empire and never spent a day in the sun. The tension between me and my father had been simmering for weeks, ever since I started looking into the Sterling Family Trust's annual audit. As a forensic accountant, I can't help but see patterns where others see noise. I had noticed a series of curious outflows from the main endowment, 6-figure sums being moved through shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, labeled as miscellaneous administrative expenses. When I brought it up to him privately in his study 2 weeks prior, the air in the room had turned to ice. He hadn't explained the numbers. He had simply told me to stay in my lane and focus on my little spreadsheets at the firm. But I didn't stay in my lane. I dug deeper, spending my late nights in my home office, surrounded by the glow of 3 27-inch Dell ultra-sharp monitors, fueled by black coffee and the nagging feeling that the foundation of our family's wealth was built on sand. I had found the paper trail that morning, a series of documents buried in a digital vault that suggested the $250,000 investment my father always claimed he made in my education and startup costs was actually a tax write-off disguised as a charitable donation to a defunct nonprofit. That night at the gala, the truth bubbled over during the traditional family toast. Alistair stood up, clinking a silver spoon against his glass, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He began his usual monologue about the sterling legacy, about hard work, and the importance of passing the torch to the next generation. He looked at Julian with a pride that was almost tangible, mentioning Julian's recent acquisition of a boutique firm in London. Then his eyes drifted to me, standing near the back, and his expression shifted into something unrecognizable. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a cold, calculated dismissal. I had approached him during a lull in the music, hoping to have one last conversation before the audit became public. I whispered to him that I knew about the clerical error, about the way he had manipulated the trust to make my existence a tax deduction. I thought, perhaps naively, that he would feel a shred of remorse. Instead, he turned toward the crowd, his voice booming without the need for a microphone, and delivered the line that would end my life as I knew it. He told the room, with a cruel smirk playing on his lips, that I was never an investment, just a $250,000 mistake that happened to be useful for the IRS. The laughter that followed was sparse but devastating, a few cousins snickering into their drinks while the elders stared at me with a pity that felt like a physical weight. My mother didn't look up from her wine glass. She simply watched the red liquid swirl, her silence a perfect endorsement of his cruelty. Julian just smirked, adjusting the cufflinks on his bespoke Brioni suit, the light catching the gold and sapphires. In that moment, the sounds of the party became a distorted roar in my ears. I could smell the expensive perfume of my aunts, a suffocating mix of Chanel No. 5 and sandalwood, and the sharp scent of the pine logs burning in the fireplace. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I didn't cry. Forensic accountants don't cry over bad data, we analyze it. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who had taught me how to read a balance sheet when I was 10, and realized he wasn't a father. He was a liquidator. He had appraised my worth and found me lacking, not because of my skills or my character, but because I wasn't the asset he wanted to manage. The sheer injustice of it vibrated through my bones. I had worked 80-hour weeks at the firm, I had earned my CPA, my CFE, and my master's in accountancy from Wharton, while Julian was busy totaling his first Ferrari on a weekend bender in the Hamptons. I had fought for every scrap of recognition, only to find out the game was rigged from the start. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the marble floor beneath my feet feeling colder than the autumn air outside. I watched a waiter pass by with a tray of empty glasses, the crystal clinking softly, a sound that reminded me of ice breaking. The sterling name, which I had carried with a sense of duty for 34 years, suddenly felt like a lead weight strapped to my ankles. I realized then that my life's work hadn't been about numbers at all. It had been about seeking a validation that was never going to be issued. Every audit I had performed, every fraud I had uncovered for my clients, was a subconscious attempt to find the fraud in my own home. And now, the audit was complete. The evidence was undeniable. I was the liability they wanted to write off. But what Alistair Sterling forgot was that I am very good at my job. I know where the bodies are buried because I'm the one who knows how to read the maps he thinks he hid. As I turned my back on the 42 relatives, on the emerald silk reflections in the tall mirrors, and on the parents who had commodified my very existence, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. The balance sheet was forged, yes, but the beautiful thing about a forgery is that once you identify it, the whole structure collapses. I walked out of that ballroom, the sound of my heels clicking on the marble like a countdown, and stepped out into the night. My Audi was waiting, its sleek lines illuminated by the estate's outdoor security lighting. I sat in the driver's seat, the smell of the fine Valcona leather interior grounding me, and I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't just Brooke Sterling anymore, the daughter who was a clerical error. I was the woman who was about to show them exactly what happens when you try to write off the only person who knows how to count your sins. Family isn't a debt you owe to the people who gave you a name. It's the loyalty of the people who don't treat you like a line item in a ledger. And as I shifted the car into gear and accelerated down the long, winding driveway of the Sterling estate, leaving the glow of the gala behind, I knew that the audit of the Sterling family was only just beginning. For 3 decades, I played the role of the responsible Sterling with a commitment that bordered on the masochistic, anchoring my identity to the virtues of hard work, fiscal discipline, and a quiet, stoic endurance that I mistakenly believed would one day be rewarded with a seat at the table of my family's affection. While the world saw the Sterling name as a golden ticket, my reality was a meticulously managed existence of self-reliance that stood in jarring, neon-lit contrast to the life of my younger brother, Chase. At 31, Chase was the family's resident golden boy and a chronically failed influencer whose entire persona was curated through a lens of unearned luxury, sustained entirely by the bleeding edge of my parents' savings accounts. He moved through life with the unbothered grace of a man who had never looked at a utility bill, driving a 2024 frozen blue metallic Porsche Taycan with a $1,200 monthly lease payment that my father covered without a second thought, while I navigated the pothole-ridden streets of Chicago in my 2018 White Orchid Pearl Honda Civic. My car had 82,000 miles on the odometer and a faint scent of stale coffee and industrial-strength upholstery cleaner from the late nights I spent commuting between my office and the modest 2-bedroom apartment I rented with my own hard-earned income. Every time I turned the key in that ignition, the familiar hum of the engine felt like a testament to my independence. Yet every time I pulled it into the sweeping, circular brick driveway of my parents' 5,400-square-foot Georgian estate in Lake Forest, Illinois, it felt like a badge of my supposed inferiority in their eyes. The Lake Forest house was a monument to the Sterling status quo, a fortress of limestone and manicured boxwood hedges where the air always seemed to be chilled to a precise, unwelcoming 68 degrees. It was here, during our mandatory Sunday dinners, that the economic disparity between the responsible daughter and the indulgent son was put on full display like a curated museum exhibit of parental favoritism. I remember sitting at the mahogany dining table, a piece that cost more than my 4 years of undergraduate tuition, watching the light from the Waterford crystal chandelier glint off the $9,500 Rolex Submariner strapped to Chase's wrist. My father had purchased it for him 3 months prior, not for a birthday or a graduation, but for what he called moral support, after Chase's third attempt at a luxury lifestyle YouTube channel failed to gain more than 500 bot-generated subscribers. Chase would sit there, swirling a glass of 2018 Silver Oak Cabernet that retailed for nearly $200 a bottle, complaining about the stress of content creation, while I sat across from him with my hands hidden under the table, my cuticles ragged from hours of paging through thousands of lines of digital financial data. I had paid off every single cent of my $45,000 student loans from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign to the penny, sacrificing vacations and new clothes and even a decent mattress to ensure I didn't owe a soul a dime. Yet my father looked at my financial autonomy as a sign of stubbornness rather than success. At these dinners, I was never Brooke, the senior forensic accountant who had just uncovered a $3 million inventory fraud for a manufacturing client. I was simply the guest who had stayed too long, a functional but uninspiring fixture of the family landscape. My mother, Lydia, would spend 40 minutes detailing the intricacies of Chase's newest business venture, which usually involved him losing another $10,000 on a cryptocurrency scheme or a failed fashion line, while barely acknowledging the fact that I had been promoted or that I was being headhunted by the Big Four firms in the city. She would adjust the silk placemats and comment on how I looked tired, suggesting that perhaps if I didn't work those 60-hour weeks at the firm, I would have more time to find a husband who could provide the lifestyle I was clearly struggling to maintain on my own. The irony was suffocating, considering I was the only one at the table who actually understood the mechanics of wealth, while they were all busy hemorrhaging it on the altar of appearances. I would listen to the clink of the sterling silver flatware against the fine bone china, a sound that underscored the profound silence that met any of my own contributions to the conversation. If I spoke about my work, my father would glaze over, his eyes drifting toward the large-screen television in the adjacent library where the stock tickers ran in a perpetual loop. But if Chase mentioned needing a new camera rig for his studio, my father's checkbook was out before the dessert course was served. The financial reality of the Sterling household was a house of cards that only I seemed capable of seeing. Or perhaps I was the only one willing to look at the structural cracks. My parents lived as if the 1990s bull market had never ended, maintaining a lifestyle that required a staggering amount of liquidity. The property taxes alone on the Lake Forest estate were over $48,000 a year, and the landscaping contract for those perfectly shaped hedges cost another $1,200 a month. While they subsidized Chase's delusions of grandeur, I was meticulously tracking my own expenses on a spreadsheet that accounted for every gallon of gas and every $15 salad I bought for lunch. I knew the exact cost of my independence, and I knew that every dollar I saved was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the inevitable collapse of their world. Yet standing in that house, surrounded by the scent of expensive lilies and lemon-scented furniture polish, I felt like a ghost in my own history. I was the one who remembered the passwords to the router, the one who handled the logistics of their medical appointments, and the one who made sure the taxes were filed on time, but I was treated with the distant, polite boredom one might show to a long-term housekeeper. I recall one specific Sunday evening when the humidity of the Illinois summer was so thick it felt like a physical weight against the windows of the dining room. Chase was going on a monologue about how his Taycan was a statement piece for his brand, completely oblivious to the fact that his insurance premiums, which my father also paid, had tripled due to his mounting collection of speeding tickets. My father nodded along, a look of genuine pride on his face, while he turned to me and asked if I could take a look at the lawnmower in the garage because the gardener said it was acting up and he didn't want to pay for a repairman. That was my role. I was the utility player, the one you called when something was broken, but never the one you invited to the victory lap. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove that I was an asset, that my stability was a gift to this family, but I was beginning to realize that in the sterling economy, stability was a depreciating currency. They didn't want a daughter who was a forensic accountant. They wanted a daughter who reflected their own vanity back at them, and my 2018 Honda Civic and my carefully managed bank account were a constant nagging reminder of the reality they were trying so desperately to ignore. The bitterness didn't come all at once. It was a slow, agonizing accumulation of moments like those, a gradual realization that no matter how many hours I worked or how many debts I settled on my own, the ledger would never balance in my favor. I would watch my mother hand Chase a $500 allowance for dinner with his friends, while she questioned me about whether I was still contributing to my 401k, her tone suggesting that my modest savings were a sign of a small, uninspired life. They viewed my responsibility as a lack of imagination, a failure to dream big like Chase, whose dreams were essentially just expensive hobbies funded by their dwindling retirement accounts. I saw the way the margins were shrinking, the way my father's hands shook slightly when he opened the monthly statements from his brokerage firm, yet he would still insist on buying the best scotch and the finest cigars for his country club cronies. I was the only one who saw the iceberg, and instead of letting me steer the ship, they had relegated me to the engine room to keep the coal burning while they danced on the deck. Being the responsible one is a lonely endeavor, especially when the people you are being responsible for treat your efforts as a baseline requirement rather than a contribution. I had spent 34 years under the impression that if I just did everything right, if I got the grades, if I got the job, if I paid the bills, I would finally be seen as an equal. But that Sunday at the Lake Forest estate, as I looked at the three of them silhouetted against the dark wood paneling of the dining room, I finally understood the terrifying truth of the status quo. I wasn't an equal, I was a safety net. And the problem with being a safety net is that the people who use you never think about the ground until they're already falling. I realized that my presence at that table wasn't requested because they enjoyed my company. It was required because I was the only thing tethering them to a reality they were terrified to face. Every time I drove away from that house, the red taillights of my Civic reflecting off the closed iron gates of the estate, I felt a little more of myself detaching from the sterling name, preparing for the moment when the forged balance sheet of our family life would finally, inevitably, be audited by the truth. The explosion didn't happen with a roar or a flash of light, but rather with the soft, rhythmic sliding of heavy cardstock out of a series of embossed manila envelopes, a sound that would forever be etched into my memory as the acoustic signature of my life's disintegration. We were gathered at the Lake Forest Country Club for the annual Heritage Celebration, an event designed to celebrate the supposed purity and longevity of the local dynasties, held in a ballroom that breathed wealth through its crown molding and the heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the cooling Illinois evening. My Aunt Margaret, a woman whose presence was always heralded by the sharp, medicinal sting of expensive gin and the cloying, suffocating cloud of her $300 an ounce Roja Parfums fragrance, had spent the last 18 months obsessed with a vanity project she called the Sterling Legacy Initiative. She had badgered every relative for saliva samples under the guise of creating a comprehensive digital family tree for the Historical Society. And tonight was the grand reveal where she intended to hand out legacy folders to each branch of the family. I sat at the table, my fingers tracing the condensation on my water glass, watching as the waitstaff in their starched black and white uniforms cleared the remains of the poached pear salads. Margaret moved from chair to chair with a predatory sort of glee, her silk caftan fluttering behind her like the wings of a socialite moth, finally dropping a thick, cream-colored envelope in front of me with a wink that suggested we were all about to be part of something legendary. When I pulled the tab on that envelope, I didn't expect a revelation. I expected a boring list of distant cousins in Scotland and perhaps a percentage point of Scandinavian blood that would be discussed over coffee and petit fours. Instead, the data on the primary page was a digital scream that seemed to vibrate off the paper and sear itself into my retinas. The bold black ink of the Ancestry DNA report, stating with clinical mathematical finality, 0.0% genetic match to Harrison Sterling. The world around me didn't just slow down, it stopped entirely. The vibrant chatter of the room collapsing into a vacuum of absolute ringing silence that was so profound I could hear the mechanical hum of the club's high-efficiency HVAC system and the distant rhythmic clink of a silver spoon hitting a porcelain plate at a table across the room. I looked at the numbers again, my brain frantically trying to calculate a margin of error, searching for a decimal point that shouldn't be there. But the forensic accountant in me knew that DNA doesn't lie in the way that ledgers do. The cold, hard columns of genetic markers were an audit that I couldn't reconcile, a deficit of biological truth that left me bankrupt of the only identity I had ever known. I looked up from the paper, my breath hitching in a throat that felt like it was closing around a shard of glass, and my eyes immediately sought out my mother, Lydia. She wasn't weeping, nor was she reaching out to comfort me. Instead, she sat with a terrifying statuesque composure, her only movement being the slow, deliberate adjustment of the 3-carat princess-cut diamond ring on her left hand. She turned the band once, then twice, the light from the crystal sconces dancing off the facets of the stone, her gaze fixed firmly on the mahogany exit doors at the far end of the ballroom, as if she were mentally calculating the shortest path to her 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class. There was no flicker of maternal instinct, no rush of apology, only a calculated, icy detachment that confirmed the paper in my hand was not a mistake, but a long overdue invoice for a secret she had successfully hidden for 34 years. The betrayal wasn't just in the infidelity that must have occurred 3 decades ago. It was in the decades of silence that followed. The way she had allowed me to grovel for the approval of a man she knew had no biological obligation to give it to me. Then I looked at Harrison, the man I had called father since I was old enough to form the syllables, the man whose stern silhouette had defined the boundaries of my world. He didn't look shocked, and he certainly didn't look heartbroken. He looked profoundly, deeply annoyed, as if the revelation of my true parentage was nothing more than a tedious clerical error that had finally leaked to the public, an inconvenient stain on the sterling brand that would require a public relations strategy to clean up. He took a slow, methodical sip of his Macallan 25, the amber liquid catching the light, and his jaw set in a line of such rigid frustration that I realized he had likely known, or at least suspected, for a very long time. His annoyance stemmed from the fact that the secret was no longer under his control, that the leverage he held over my mother and the disdain he held for me were now being broadcast to the 42 relatives currently staring at us with wide, hungry eyes. He didn't see a daughter in crisis. He saw a breach of contract, a liability that had moved from the private ledger to the public record, and in that moment, the $250,000 clerical error comment from the gala earlier that year finally snapped into a devastating, crystalline focus. The silence in the country club was a living thing, thick with the smell of roasting lamb and the metallic tang of my own rising adrenaline. I could feel the eyes of my Aunt Margaret on me, her expression shifting from triumphant to horrified as she realized her vanity project had just detonated a nuclear device in the center of the family's social standing. To my left, Chase was staring at my folder, his mouth slightly agape, his $9,500 Rolex catching the light as he shifted in his seat, probably wondering if this meant his own share of the inheritance had just doubled. The contrast was almost comical. The golden son, the Porsche-driving influencer who was a drain on every resource, was likely the biological heir, while the daughter who had worked 60-hour weeks, paid her own way, and maintained the sterling reputation with every fiber of her being, was a stranger in her own skin. I felt a surge of nausea so potent I had to grip the edge of the table, the white linen tablecloth bunching under my fingernails, as I realized that every Sunday dinner, every holiday, and every moment of academic or professional achievement I had presented to Harrison was a performance given to a man who was merely an audience member, not a participant in my life. I stood up, the chair legs scraping against the polished hardwood floor with a sound like a dying animal, and the movement seemed to break the spell of the room. A few relatives looked away, suddenly fascinated by their dessert spoons or the floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and eucalyptus. I didn't say a word to Harrison, and I didn't look at my mother again. I couldn't bear to see the exit-focused calculation in her eyes for a second longer. I clutched the legacy folder to my chest, the paper crinkling under my arm, and walked toward the same doors my mother had been eyeing. Every step felt like I was walking through deep water, my Jimmy Choo heels clicking with a hollow, lonely rhythm that echoed the emptiness growing in my chest. I passed by the bar, where the scent of gin was even stronger, and burst through the heavy mahogany doors into the cool, humid night air of Lake Forest. The valet, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, saw my face and scrambled to retrieve my 2018 Honda Civic, his movements frantic and awkward in the face of my obvious distress. As I waited under the green and white striped awning of the club, I looked back at the glowing windows of the ballroom. Inside, the elite were regrouping, the whispers already beginning to swirl like smoke, the sterling name being dissected and devalued in real time. I thought about the $45,000 in student loans I had paid off, the years of my life I had given to a firm just to prove I was worthy of a name that wasn't even mine, and the crushing realization that I had been an accountant for a family that was fundamentally insolvent. I was 34 years old, a senior forensic accountant who was supposed to be an expert at identifying fraud, yet I had missed the biggest embezzlement of all, the theft of my own heritage. When my Civic was finally brought around, its modest engine idling with a hum that felt more honest than anything I had heard inside that building, I climbed in and locked the doors, the sound of the central locking system providing a small, metallic sense of security. I sat there for a moment, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, looking at the manila envelope on the passenger seat. The 0% genetic match was more than just a biological fact. It was a release. If I wasn't a sterling, Then I didn't have to carry the weight of their expectations, their failures, or their cold, transactional version of love. I didn't have to be the responsible one for a group of people who viewed me as a tax break or a mistake. The betrayal was absolute, but the clarity it provided was a weapon I didn't know I possessed. I put the car in gear and drove away from the country club, the red glow of the taillights disappearing into the dark, tree-lined streets of the suburbs. I was no longer Brooke Sterling, the overlooked daughter. I was Brooke, the woman who was about to audit every single lie they had ever told me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the balance sheet. I only cared about the truth, and I knew that before this was over, the Sterling family would realize that the girl they thought was a clerical error was actually the only person who knew how to make them pay what they owed. Family isn't about DNA, and it isn't about names on a will. It's about the people who don't let a vanity project tell them who you are. As I reached the highway, the speedometer climbing, I felt the first sparks of a cold, forensic rage. They had tried to erase me from their history, but they had forgotten that I was the one who kept the books, and I was about to show them that a 0% match meant I had nothing left to lose and everything to dismantle. The drive away from the country club was a blur of streetlights and rising adrenaline, a mechanical flight that ended when I pulled my 2018 Honda Civic into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Starlight Diner, a 24-hour relic on the edge of Lake Forest that smelled of burnt toast and industrial-grade floor cleaner. I sat in a corner booth, the red vinyl cracked and taped with silver duct tape that caught the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lights, and stared at a $4.50 cup of black coffee that was too hot to drink and too bitter to enjoy. The silence of the diner was punctuated only by the low hum of a refrigeration unit and the distant, rhythmic scrape of a spatula against a flat-top grill, providing a sterile environment for the wreckage of my identity to settle. On a grease-stained paper napkin I'd pulled from a chrome dispenser, I didn't write about the hollow ache in my chest or the way my mother's face looked when she calculated her escape route. Instead, I took out my matte black Fisher space pen and began to write a list of assets, liabilities, and legal exposure. For 10 years, I had served as the invisible architect of the Sterling Family Trust's financial structure, managing their tax filings and annual audits for free under the misguided impression that I was contributing to a collective legacy. I had been the one to stay up until 3 a.m. every April, reconciling their convoluted statements from J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, believing that my diligence was a form of love that didn't need to be spoken aloud. But as the steam rose from my coffee, the quiet realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I hadn't just been a daughter. I had been a shield. I began to map out the mental ledger I had carried for a decade, documenting every offshore account in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands that Harrison had insisted were for tax efficiency, but which I now saw as the barricades of a massive systemic fraud. I recalled the specific 6-figure transfers I had flagged over the years, transactions I had smoothed over with legal loopholes because I trusted the man who signed the checks. I wrote down the dates and the specific dollar amounts of Chase's business expenses, remembering the $12,000 marketing retreat in Las Vegas that was actually a 3-day bender at the Wynn, and the $8,500 consulting fee paid to a shell company that existed only to fund my brother's habit of buying vintage sneakers and high-stakes poker buy-ins. They hadn't just lied to me about my DNA, which was a betrayal of the blood. They had used my professional license, my hard-earned reputation as a senior forensic accountant, and my clean record to camouflage their criminal activity. They had turned my integrity into a weapon to be used against the very laws I had sworn to uphold, effectively making me an unwitting accomplice to their financial house of cards. The sheer scale of the manipulation was staggering when viewed through the cold, clinical lens of a forensic audit. I realized then that loyalty is a liability when you are dealing with criminals, a luxury that I could no longer afford if I wanted to survive the inevitable collapse of the Sterling Empire. Every time I had found an irregularity and brought it to Harrison, only to have him pat my hand and tell me I was being too thorough, he was actually gauging my complicity, testing the limits of my blind devotion to a family that didn't even claim me in their genetic code. I thought about the $250,000 clerical error he had mocked at the gala, and I finally understood that the figure wasn't just a random insult. It was likely the exact amount of a specific tax break he had achieved by claiming me as a dependent or a business expense in a year when he should have been paying millions in capital gains. My life had been a line item, a strategic deduction on a 1040 form, and my professional skills were the ink he used to hide the red. The anger that began to simmer in my gut wasn't the hot, impulsive rage of a woman scorned. It was the cold, calculating fury of an auditor who has just found the smoking gun in a pile of shredded documents. I looked at the napkin, now covered in the shorthand of forensic accounting. Account numbers, wire transfer routes, and the names of entities like Sterling Global Holdings and Lydia's Legacy LLC, and I saw a map of their destruction. I knew where Harrison had hidden the $4.2 million from the sale of the Highland Park property, money that had never seen the light of an IRS reporting form, and I knew exactly which charitable donations were actually kickbacks to the board members who approved his zoning variances. They had treated me like a guest who stayed too long, but they had forgotten that the guest had the keys to the safe and the passwords to the encrypted servers. I felt a strange, chilling sense of empowerment as I realized that the 0% genetic match was the ultimate severance package. If I wasn't a Sterling, I had no fiduciary duty to protect the Sterling secrets, and I certainly had no moral obligation to go down with a ship that was built on the theft of my own life. The fluorescent lights of the diner flickered, reflecting off the surface of my cold coffee, and for the first time in 34 years, I saw my father not as a patriarch to be feared, but as a defendant to be prosecuted. I spent the next 2 hours in that booth, oblivious to the truck drivers and night shift workers drifting in and out, as I mentally reconstructed the last 5 years of the family trust's filings. I could see the patterns of money laundering clearly now, the way the funds flowed through my mother's antique business in Lake Forest, a boutique that sold 3 pieces a year, but somehow reported $1 million in revenue, and how that cash was used to pay off Chase's mounting debts and the lease on his 2024 Porsche Taycan. The betrayal was total, a 360-degree environment of lies that touched every part of my existence, from the car I drove to the education I had paid for myself while they were using my name to shelter their greed. I realized that my independence, the very thing they mocked as a lack of imagination, was actually my greatest asset. I was the only one in the family whose hands were clean, and that meant I was the only one who could pull the lever that would bring the whole gilded ceiling crashing down on their heads. The Sterling status quo was a forgery, a series of inflated assets and hidden liabilities, and I was the only one with the forensic tools to expose the fraud for what it was. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, sickly light over the industrial landscape outside the diner, I paid my bill with a crisp $5 bill, leaving the 50-cent change on the sticky table as a final tip. I took the grease-stained napkin with me, folding it carefully and tucking it into my Saint Laurent clutch like a high-stakes contract. Walking out into the cool morning air, I felt a profound shift in my internal architecture. The woman who had entered the diner was a victim of a DNA test, but the woman walking out was a predator with a spreadsheet. I drove back to my modest apartment, the 2018 Honda Civic feeling like a getaway vehicle, and as I passed the exit for the Lake Forest estate, I didn't even look toward the limestone walls. I knew that Harrison and Lydia were likely sleeping soundly in their 400 thread count sheets, unaware that their clerical error was currently calculating the interest and penalties on a lifetime of deception. Family isn't blood, and it isn't a shared name. Family is a contract of mutual respect, and since the Sterlings had breached that contract in every possible way, I was now moving into the liquidation phase of our relationship. I spent that Sunday morning in my home office, not in the Lake Forest dining room, surrounded by the glow of my monitors and the quiet hum of my hard drives. I began to download the backup files I had kept of the family's tax records, backups Harrison thought I had deleted years ago, And as the progress bars moved steadily across the screen, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in decades. I was no longer trying to prove I was a Sterling. I was proving I was a professional. I thought about the heritage celebration and the clink of the silver spoons, and I realized that the Sterling legacy was about to become a cautionary tale in a federal courtroom. They had mistaken my silence for compliance and my responsibility for weakness, but they were about to learn that in the world of forensic accounting, the person who keeps the books is the one who ultimately decides who gets written off. I was Brooke, a woman whose worth was no longer tied to a forged balance sheet, and as I watched the data populate my screen, I knew that the audit of the Sterling family was finally, officially, underway. I didn't call a therapist to process the psychological wreckage of discovering my entire existence was a tax-advantaged lie, nor did I seek the comfort of friends who would offer empty platitudes about how blood doesn't define a person. Instead, I reached into my professional network and called Marcus Thorne, a high-stakes litigation attorney whose reputation for clinical ruthlessness was matched only by the astronomical height of his billing floor. Walking into his office on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower in downtown Chicago felt like entering a sanctuary of cold, hard justice, a space that smelled perpetually of old cedar, expensive stationery, and the faint metallic tang of high-end air filtration. Marcus sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of dark mahogany, charging $650 per hour to listen with a predatory stillness that made me realize I wasn't just a victim, but a client with a catastrophic amount of leverage. I didn't cry when I sat across from him. I simply opened my leather-bound portfolio and laid out the grease-stained napkin from the Starlight Diner alongside a thumb drive containing a decade of encrypted financial data. I told him that I wanted to perform a full-scale forensic deconstruction of the Sterling family trust, not for the sake of an inheritance I no longer legally shared, but for the sake of an accountability that was 34 years overdue. Following that meeting, I disappeared into what I can only describe as a digital bunker for 14 agonizing, exhilarating days, transforming my second bedroom into a command center where the only light came from the blue-white glare of my dual-monitor setup. I lived on lukewarm espresso from my Breville machine and the singular driving focus of a woman who had finally found a purpose for every hour of overtime she had ever worked. I began the grueling process of pulling the Sterling Trust's 10K filings, cross-referencing them with internal bank statements I had archived from 2016 through early 2025, and creating a chronological map of every dollar that had ever moved through Harrison's fingers. I utilized high-resolution scans of the original trust documents, zooming in until the pixels of the ink became boulders, revealing the shaky, unnatural hesitations in the forged signatures Harrison had used to bypass my grandmother's specific restrictive covenants. My grandmother, Abigail Sterling, had intended for the estate to be a perpetual foundation for education and civic duty. But through the lens of my forensic software, I watched as Harrison's digital pen had systematically dismantled her wishes, redirecting funds into private equity accounts and lifestyle maintenance disbursements that fueled the Sterling family's gilded facade. The technical specifications of the fraud were breathtaking in their arrogance, a complex dance of shell companies like North Star Logistics and Lake Forest Equities that existed solely to move cash from the trust's corpus into Harrison's personal brokerage accounts. I spent 48 hours straight just tracing a single $400,000 wire transfer that had been disguised as a capital improvement project for the estate's roof, only to find that the money had actually been used to settle a private debt Chase had incurred during a disastrous week in Macau. I didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night, my eyes burning from the constant scrolling of spreadsheets, but the more I uncovered, the more the weight of the Sterling name lifted off my shoulders. I was no longer Brooke the clerical error. I was Brooke the auditor, and I was building an arsenal that would make a federal prosecutor blush. I documented every business lunch at the Peninsula Chicago that was actually a 3-generation family dinner, Every gallon of premium fuel for the 2024 Porsche Taycan that was charged to the trust's operations account, and every penny of the $250,000 that Harrison had explicitly labeled as Brooks' maintenance, while never actually spending a dime of it on my behalf. By the end of the second week, I had compiled a 114-page dossier that was as dense as a brick and twice as heavy with the weight of impending consequences. I organized the evidence with the surgical precision I had honed over years at the firm, using color-coded tabs and hyperlinked indices that connected every forged signature to a specific financial loss. The total embezzlement I discovered was staggering: $1,422,900. It wasn't just a round number, it was a precise calculation of Harrison's greed, a figure that represented 10 years of systematic theft from his own mother's legacy and from the government. I had the records of the fraudulent tax returns I had been tricked into signing, the ones where Harrison had provided me with falsified cost basis reports for the trust's assets, and I had the proof that he had deliberately manipulated my professional standing to cover his tracks. Sitting in the middle of my office, surrounded by stacks of printed ledgers and the hum of my cooling fans, I felt a strange, cold peace. The Sterling family thought they had written me out of their story, but they had actually given me the pen, and the story I was writing was a criminal indictment. I remember the exact moment the final calculation hit the bottom of my spreadsheet, the red numbers turning black as the formula reconciled. The $1,422,900 wasn't just money. It was the price of their betrayal, the exact cost of their silence, and the ultimate proof that the man who called me a mistake was the one who had made the most expensive error of all. I looked at the high-resolution scan of my grandmother's real signature, firm, elegant, and filled with a grace the current generation of Sterlings lacked, and then at Harrison's clumsy imitation, and I realized that my entire life had been a quest to balance a ledger that was fundamentally broken. I wasn't just fighting for the money because I didn't want their tainted wealth. I was fighting for the integrity of the record. I called Marcus Thorne back on a Tuesday afternoon, my voice steady and devoid of the tremor that had defined my interactions with my family for years. I told him the dossier was complete, that the total was verified, and that I was ready to move from the gathering phase into the execution phase. Marcus's response was a low, appreciative hum that suggested he was already calculating the billable hours for the upcoming depositions. But more than that, he sounded impressed. He told me that in 20 years of high-stakes litigation, he had never seen a client provide a more comprehensive roadmap to a defendant's destruction. I spent the rest of that evening bound indexing the physical copies of the dossier, the smell of fresh toner filling my apartment, a scent that felt like progress. I thought about Harrison sitting in his study in Lake Forest, perhaps sipping a scotch and feeling secure in the knowledge that he had successfully humiliated the only person who could hurt him. He didn't know that the clerical error was currently organizing his downfall into 15 distinct categories of felony fraud. He didn't know that every time he had ignored me at the dinner table, he had given me more time to watch, to learn, and to record. He had treated me like a ghost in his house, forgetting that ghosts have the most time to find where the secrets are buried. The dossier was a masterpiece of forensic work, a 114-page testament to the fact that you should never underestimate the person who handles your paperwork. It contained everything from the 2016 bank statements that showed the first unauthorized withdrawal to the 2025 projections that proved Harrison was planning to liquidate the remaining trust assets to cover his mounting personal losses. I had even found evidence that Lydia's antique business had been used to launder nearly $300,000 of the embezzled funds, making her just as complicit in the financial rot as her husband. The Sterlings had spent decades building a fortress of appearances, but they had used paper that I knew how to burn. As I tucked the final page into the heavy, black binder, I felt a sense of finality that the DNA test hadn't quite provided. That test told me who I wasn't, but this dossier told me exactly who they were. They were thieves who had dressed themselves in the garments of a legacy they didn't deserve, and I was the person who was going to strip them bare in front of the world they so desperately tried to impress. That night, I slept for 8 hours straight, the first real sleep I'd had since the heritage celebration. I dreamed of numbers moving in perfect, harmonious columns, a world where the truth was a fixed constant and the lies were just outliers to be corrected. When I woke up, the morning light was hitting the 114-page dossier on my desk, and for the first time in 34 years, the name Sterling didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a target. I dressed in my best charcoal gray power suit, the one I usually reserved for high-stakes audits with board directors, and I picked up the black binder with a grip that was as firm as my grandmother's signature. I wasn't going to Lake Forest for Sunday dinner, and I wasn't going to the firm to work a 60-hour week for someone else's benefit. I was going to Marcus Thorne's office to initiate a sequence of events that would end the Sterling status quo forever. The audit was over, the evidence was gathered, and as I walked out of my apartment, the sound of the door clicking shut echoed like a gavel. The Sterling family had called me an investment error, but they were about to find out that I was the most expensive liability they would ever have to face. The stage for the final audit was set at the Sterling estate, transformed for the evening into a glittering fortress of ego to celebrate Harrison's 60th birthday, an event he had titled the Diamond Jubilee of Leadership. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the salt spray of expensive sea-salted appetizers, a sensory backdrop to a production that had cost the Sterling Family Trust exactly $12,000 in catering fees alone, not including the $4,500 retainer for the string quartet currently playing a sanitized, upbeat arrangement of Mozart in the sunken garden. 85 guests, the absolute crust of Lake Forest society and the Chicago financial elite, moved across the lawn like slow-motion predators in silk and wool, their voices a low, cultured hum that masked the hollow rot at the center of the celebration. I arrived precisely at 8:14 p.m., pulling my 2018 Honda Civic into the center of the driveway, the humble white sedan looking like a puncture wound in a sea of black Mercedes-Benzes and silver Range Rovers. I stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the charcoal gray tailored suit I had chosen for the occasion, a three-piece ensemble that cost me 2 weeks' salary but felt like a suit of Kevlar armor against the psychological warfare I knew was coming. I didn't carry a gift wrapped in silver paper or a bottle of vintage scotch. Instead, I gripped the handle of a heavy, pebble-grained black leather briefcase that contained the 114-page dossier of Harrison's financial sins. Walking through the grand limestone archway of the estate, I could feel the invisible barrier of the Sterling status quo pushing against me, the same suffocating pressure that had dictated my role as the responsible, invisible daughter for over 3 decades. The foyer was illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier that cast thousands of dancing, jagged lights across the marble floor, and the catering staff from Silver Spoon Events moved with practiced, invisible efficiency, carrying silver trays of Wagyu beef sliders topped with gold leaf and glasses of 2014 Louis Roederer Cristal that retailed for $300 a bottle. My mother, Lydia, was standing near the grand staircase, her custom Valentino gown a shimmering shade of champagne that perfectly matched her cold, unblinking eyes as she watched the guests arrive, her fingers reflexively twisting the 3-carat diamond ring that was now, in my mind, simply an unrecovered asset. Chase was nearby, leaning against a Doric column with a glass of bourbon in one hand and his $9,500 Rolex Submariner gleaming under the spotlights, looking every bit the entitled heir who had never seen the red ink on his own life's balance sheet. He caught my eye and smirked, a look of pure, unadulterated condescension that told me he still thought I was just the bitter, discarded sister who didn't know her place. Harrison was the sun around which this entire grotesque system orbited, standing at the center of the ballroom with a posture that suggested he believed the very earth was his subsidiary. He looked every bit the patriarch in his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, his silver hair swept back with a precision that hinted at his obsession with control and his absolute certainty that he was untouchable. As I approached him, The string quartet reached a crescendo, and the surrounding guests paused their conversations to watch the interaction, their faces a gallery of curiosity and judgment. Harrison didn't offer a greeting, nor did he acknowledge the 14 days of silence that had passed since the heritage celebration. Instead, he waited until the immediate circle of guests was quiet enough for his voice to carry, before he sneered at me with a cruel, practiced efficiency. He looked at my suit, then at the heavy briefcase in my hand, and his lip curled in a gesture of pure, calculated disdain as he asked if I had found my real father yet, or if I was simply back at the estate because I was looking for more charity. The laughter that rippled through the immediate circle was sharp and metallic, the sound of people who had been trained to find cruelty charming when it came from a man with a 9-figure net worth. The insult didn't sting the way it would have 2 weeks ago because, in the cold, clinical logic of a forensic accountant, an insult is just noise that obscures the data. I stood my ground on the marble floor, the soles of my shoes feeling rooted to the foundation of the house, and I didn't let my expression flicker into anything resembling hurt or anger. I looked Harrison directly in the eye, noting the burst capillaries in his nose and the slight tremor in his hand as he held his crystal glass, physical markers of the stress and the scotch that were slowly eating away at the man behind the mask. The $12,000 catering bill, the $4,500 string quartet, the $92 million company. None of it belonged to him in the way he thought it did. It was all collateral for a debt he didn't realize had been called in. I could smell the expensive gin on the breath of the relatives standing nearby, and I could hear the faint, distant sound of a fountain splashing in the garden, a tranquil sound that contrasted sharply with the predatory tension in the ballroom. I was the only person in that room who knew the exact dollar amount of the fraud that had funded the very floor we were standing on, and that knowledge felt like a live wire humming in my veins. Harrison took a step closer, his shadow falling over me, trying to use his height as a final method of intimidation, his scent of sandalwood and old money acting like a suffocating blanket. He gestured vaguely toward the briefcase, asking if that was my little audit, or perhaps a collection of my student loan statements that I wanted him to pay off as a final act of mercy before he officially removed me from the family records. My mother took a sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving the exit, while Chase let out a sharp, barking laugh that sounded forced and hollow in the vast space of the foyer. They all thought this was the final act of my humiliation, the moment where the clerical error was finally deleted from the sterling history, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the trap I had set. I hadn't come here to argue about my DNA, and I hadn't come here to beg for a place at their table. I had come to serve the first notice of a liquidation that would leave them with nothing but the truth they had spent 34 years trying to bury. I gripped the handle of the briefcase tighter, feeling the texture of the leather against my palm, a physical tether to the 114-page dossier that represented the end of Harrison's empire. I looked around the room at the 85 guests, the lawyers, the bankers, the socialites, and I realized that they weren't just guests. They were witnesses to an impending bankruptcy of character. The string quartet began a slower, more melancholic piece, the cello notes vibrating through the floorboards and up into my heels, and for a fleeting second, I felt a pang of something that might have been pity for the people they were about to become. But then I remembered the grease-stained napkin in the Starlight Diner, the $1,422,900 in embezzled funds, and the cold, calculated way Harrison had called my life a clerical error in front of the world. The pity vanished, replaced by the absolute, immovable clarity of a professional who has found a terminal error in the books. I wasn't there for charity, and I didn't need to find a real father to know who I was. I was Brooke, the senior forensic accountant who was about to prove that in the final accounting, the truth is the only asset that doesn't depreciate. Harrison's sneer deepened when I didn't respond immediately, his arrogance blinded by the belief that my silence was a sign of defeat. He turned back to his circle of sycophants, ready to deliver another cutting remark to secure his status as the unchallenged patriarch of the evening. He didn't notice the way I stepped toward the mahogany table where the guest book and the vintage champagne bottles were displayed. Nor did he see the calm, methodical way I began to unlatch the brass buckles of my briefcase. The sound of the metal clicking open was lost in the swell of the music and the clink of crystal. But to me, it sounded like the cocking of a weapon. I looked at the 2014 Louis Roederer Cristal, bubbles rising in the flutes like tiny golden countdowns, and I realized that the Sterling family's vintage was about to turn to vinegar. Everything in this house, from the $1,200 monthly landscaping to the 3-carat diamond on my mother's finger, was bought with the interest on a lie, and the interest had just reached its maturity date. I stood there for a heartbeat longer, watching the patriarch bask in the glow of his own manufactured legacy, surrounded by the 85 people who only loved him for the credit limit of his offshore accounts. I felt the cool air from the HVAC system on my face, the same system I had tracked the fraudulent maintenance payments for, and I felt a sense of completion that no DNA test could ever provide. The trap wasn't just this party. The trap was the last 34 years of my life, a period of observation and endurance that had prepared me for this exact moment of execution. As Harrison raised his glass for what he thought would be the opening toast of his greatest year, I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the first 3 copies of the dossier, the white paper gleaming under the chandelier like a spotlight. I wasn't just a guest who stayed too long. I was the auditor who had finally finished the report, and as I stepped back into the center of the room, I knew that before the string quartet finished their next set, the name Sterling would mean something entirely different to everyone in this room. The setup was complete. The audience was captive, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the balance sheet, because I was the one holding the red pen. I didn't scream, and I didn't succumb to the tremors of adrenaline that were threatening to vibrate through my hands, because a professional execution requires a steady grip and an unwavering commitment to the sequence of events. I waited with the practiced patience of a predator for the moment of the traditional birthday toasts, watching as the room transitioned from the frantic energy of networking to a focused, respectful silence as Harrison stepped toward the center of the ballroom to receive the adulation he believed he had bought and paid for. When the final clink of a silver spoon against a crystal flute signaled the start of the ceremony, I moved toward the mahogany podium with a deliberate, rhythmic stride that cut through the crowd like a scalpel, and before the MC could speak, I took the microphone into my own steady hand. The 85 guests, including the high-powered board members of the Sterling Family Foundation and the silent partners of Sterling Global Logistics, watched me with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning scandal, their faces illuminated by the warm, deceptive glow of the golden chandeliers. I didn't waste a single syllable on the biological betrayal or the DNA test that had categorized me as a $250,000 mistake. Instead, I looked directly into the eyes of the man who had called my life a clerical error and told the room that I had a gift for everyone in attendance, a gift that would finally bring the family's true legacy into the light of the public record. I didn't talk about my feelings or the decades of being treated like a ghost at the dinner table. I talked about the specific, documented $1,422,900 that had systematically vanished from the family's charitable foundation over the last 9 years. I opened my heavy, pebble-grained leather briefcase and began handing out the first 20 copies of the 114-page forensic audit I had performed in my digital bunker, the thick stacks of paper passing through the hands of lawyers, bankers, and community leaders with a sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. I watched the atmosphere in the room shift from celebratory to clinical in a matter of seconds as I detailed the exact flow of funds from the Abigail Sterling Endowment through shell companies like North Star Logistics and into the personal accounts used to fund Chase's $1,200 monthly Porsche payments and Harrison's private gambling debts. I spoke with the detached, unwavering tone of a senior forensic accountant, citing specific ledger entries and wire transfer confirmation numbers that corresponded to the documents currently being scanned by the horrified eyes of the Foundation's board of directors. The color didn't just fade from Harrison's face. It drained out of him in a terrifying, visible wave, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash as he realized that the person he had dismissed as a liability was the only person who possessed the roadmap to his criminal destruction. As the realization of the wire fraud and the tax evasion settled over the room like a suffocating fog, the silence became so heavy it felt as if the very air had turned to lead, punctuated only by the crisp, rhythmic turning of pages as the board members encountered the high-resolution scans of the forged signatures. It was in this vacuum of shock that someone in the back of the room, perhaps one of the aunts who had laughed at Harrison's cruelty only moments before, let a crystal flute of 2014 Louis Roederer crystals slip from their trembling fingers, and it shattered against the marble floor with a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the vaulted ballroom like a gunshot. The sound seemed to break the spell of Harrison's authority forever, and I watched as the men who had been his closest allies stepped physically away from him, their loyalties evaporating in the heat of a documented felony. I didn't stop until I had detailed every kickback, every laundered dollar that had passed through my mother's antique business, and every fraudulent deduction that had been used to maintain the 5,400-square-foot facade of the Lake Forest estate. I could smell the ozone of the cooling system and the metallic tang of Harrison's rising panic, a scent that was far more satisfying than the $300 an ounce perfume my Aunt Margaret had worn to the Heritage celebration. I finished my delivery by leaning into the microphone, my voice dropping to a low, conversational frequency that carried to every corner of the 85-guest gala with the weight of an unappeasable verdict. I looked at Harrison, who was now clutching the edge of a catering table for support, his midnight blue tuxedo looking like a costume on a man who had finally been stripped of his title, and I told him that while the DNA test might confirm I am not biologically a Sterling, the bank records confirm with absolute certainty that he is a felon. I concluded the evening by stating that I thought we were both having a very bad day, though mine was at least grounded in the freedom of the truth, while his was just the beginning of a lifelong debt to the federal government. I closed my briefcase with a final echoing snap of the brass buckles and stepped down from the podium, walking through a sea of guests who now looked at me not with pity, but with a terrifying newfound respect that bordered on fear. I passed my mother, who was staring at her 3-carat diamond ring as if it had suddenly turned into a pair of handcuffs, and I walked past Chase, whose failed influencer dreams had just been replaced by the very real prospect of an indigent future. The exit from the Sterling estate was the most honest walk I had ever taken in my 34 years. The cool night air hitting my face with a crispness that felt like the first breath of a new life. I walked past the 2024 Porsche Taycan and the Bentley Mulsanne, realizing that these were no longer symbols of power but assets that would soon be seized and liquidated to satisfy the massive liabilities I had just uncovered. I climbed into my 2018 Honda Civic, the modest interior feeling like a sanctuary of integrity, and as I started the engine, the hum of the machine felt like a final, triumphant note in a symphony of accountability. I drove down the winding, brick-lined driveway for the last time, seeing the red glow of my taillights reflecting off the iron gates that could no longer keep the truth inside the limestone walls. I had spent my life trying to prove I was an asset to a family that was fundamentally insolvent of character, and in the end, I had performed the most successful audit of my career by writing them all off as a total loss. Family is not defined by the blood that flows through your veins, but by the integrity of the promises you keep. And as the Sterling estate disappeared in my rearview mirror, I realized that I hadn't lost a father at all. I had gained a life that was finally, for the very first time, perfectly in balance. The quiet of the car was a profound contrast to the explosive revelation I had just delivered, and as I reached the highway, I felt the last of the Sterling name falling away from me like dead weight. I thought about the 114 pages of the dossier and the $1,422,900 in missing funds, and I knew that Marcus Thorne would be receiving a flurry of panicked phone calls by morning. but they would be too late to stop the momentum of the evidence. I was no longer a guest who stayed too long, and I was no longer a clerical error waiting to be corrected. I was a woman who had used the very tools they gave me to dismantle the cage they had built around me. The technical specifications of my revenge were precise, the financial impact was total, and the emotional resolution was absolute, because I had finally understood that you cannot audit someone into loving you, but you can certainly audit them into respecting the truth. I drove toward the city, the Chicago skyline shimmering in the distance like a promise of a future where I wouldn't have to balance my worth against someone else's lies. The audit of the Sterling family was closed, the findings were public, and as I accelerated into the night, I knew that the only thing that mattered was that my own balance sheet was finally, undeniably, clean. The shockwaves of that night at the Diamond Jubilee did not dissipate with the morning sun, but instead crystallized into the cold, mechanical process of a systematic dismantling that left the Sterling name a hollowed-out shell in the public record. Harrison is currently facing 3 counts of felony embezzlement, with the state prosecutor utilizing my 114-page dossier as the primary roadmap for a grand jury indictment that has already frozen every domestic and offshore account he once used to posture as a patriarch. A massive civil suit, filed by the new executors of my grandmother's foundation, is currently moving through the Illinois court system with a surgical precision that will ultimately liquidate the 5,400-square-foot Lake Forest estate, the limestone walls and manicured boxwood hedges being appraised to satisfy the $1.4 million debt he owed to a legacy he tried to forge. I watched from a distance as the Golden Boy's life hit the same brick wall of reality, hearing through the grapevine of the firm that Chase's 2024 frozen blue metallic Porsche Taycan was repossessed 12 days ago from the parking lot of a high-end gym he could no longer afford the membership for. The image of that luxury vehicle being hoisted onto a flatbed while the $1,200 monthly lease was officially marked as a total loss felt like the final satisfying period at the end of a very long, very fraudulent sentence. I didn't stay in Chicago to watch the embers of their lives cool. Instead, I packed my life into a series of structured moving boxes and drove west, far away from the humidity of the Midwest and the suffocating expectations of a family that never existed. I moved into a quiet, 1,200-square-foot contemporary condo in the Queen Anne neighborhood of Seattle, a space defined by clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over the gray-blue expanse of Elliott Bay, and a sense of peace that doesn't cost a cent in emotional tax. This home was paid for with my own hard-earned salary and the bonuses I earned from a decade of being the most thorough forensic accountant in the business. Every square foot of the light oak flooring and every polished quartz countertop a testament to a life built on actual assets rather than forged signatures. I spend my mornings watching the fog roll over the Sound, drinking coffee from a simple ceramic mug that doesn't have a crest on it, and for the first time in 34 years, I don't feel the need to audit the air I breathe. My professional license remains untarnished, a rare achievement in the wake of such a scandal, because Marcus Thorne was able to prove that I was a victim of the same fraud I eventually exposed, my integrity acting as the only currency that survived the Sterling bankruptcy. The most profound realization of this aftermath, however, wasn't found in a bank statement or a court filing, but in a digital match that appeared on my screen 3 weeks after I settled in Washington. Using the same database that had initially shattered my world with its 0% genetic match to Harrison, I finally located my biological father, a man whose existence had been the greatest secret my mother ever kept. His name is Silas, a 61-year-old high school history teacher living in a modest, cedar-shingled house in a small town outside of Olympia, a man whose digital footprint is a humble collection of academic papers and photos of a well-tended vegetable garden. Through our initial exchange of emails, I learned that he had never known I existed, that his brief summer with my mother decades ago was a memory she had systematically erased from her own narrative to ensure her place in the Sterling hierarchy. Silas doesn't have a 10K filing, and he doesn't have an offshore account in the Caymans. He has a voice that sounds like warm wood and a laugh that carries none of the sharp, metallic edges of the man who raised me. We are meeting for coffee next Tuesday at 10 a.m. at a small, independent roastery near the waterfront. And for the first time in my life, I am walking into a meeting without a briefcase full of evidence or a defensive suit of armor. The irony of the situation is not lost on me as I sit in my new living room, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the pages of a book I am finally reading for pleasure rather than for an audit. I spent my youth trying to be the perfect Sterling, a role that required me to be the responsible, invisible engine of their greed, only to find that the very people I was trying to save were the ones who had stolen my identity before I was even old enough to speak my own name. The $250,000 clerical error that Harrison mocked was actually the price he paid to hide the truth, a transaction that eventually became the catalyst for his own undoing when he underestimated the daughter he thought he had successfully commodified. I think back to the Sunday dinners in Lake Forest, the clink of silver on china and the smell of expensive gin, and I realize that those moments were the true liabilities of my life, debts of time and energy paid to a phantom legacy. Now, my life is a 1,200 square foot sanctuary of honesty, where the only things that matter are the things I can account for with my own hands. The legal proceedings against Harrison are expected to drag on for years, a slow-motion car crash of depositions and discovery phases that will peel back every layer of the Sterling global logistics empire to reveal the rot underneath. My mother has retreated to a small rental property in Florida, her 3-carat diamond long since sold to cover the initial retainers for the lawyers who are currently failing to protect her from the fallout of her silence. Chase is reportedly trying to pivot his brand into a redemption arc on social media, filming videos from a studio apartment that smells of desperation and cheap cologne, oblivious to the fact that the world has no interest in a golden boy whose gold was actually just gold-plated fraud. They are all currently paying the interest on a lifetime of deception, while I am finally living in the black, my moral ledger balanced and my future no longer tied to the depreciating value of a stolen name. As I prepare for my meeting with Silas, I find myself thinking about the nature of family and the weight of the truths we choose to carry. I am no longer Brooke Sterling, the senior forensic accountant who balanced the books for criminals. I am simply Brooke, a woman who had the courage to audit her own life and the strength to accept that the findings were catastrophic. The truth is a devastating weapon when used correctly, but it is also a foundation upon which something real can finally be built. I look at the calendar on my desk, the appointment for Tuesday at 10 a.m. circled in a soft blue ink, and I feel a sense of anticipation that has nothing to do with percentages or wire transfers. I am meeting a man who teaches history, a man who understands that the past is a series of events that can be studied but never truly erased, and I am ready to start a new chapter that isn't written in the margins of someone else's tax return. My condo in Seattle is filled with the scent of fresh rain and the quiet hum of a life that is finally mine, a space where the status quo is defined by authenticity rather than appearance. I have replaced my Saint Laurent clutch with a sturdy, functional backpack, and I have traded my 4-inch Jimmy Choo stilettos for a pair of comfortable boots that can handle the Pacific Northwest terrain. I am still an accountant, but I now use my skills to help small nonprofits and community organizations navigate their finances, ensuring that their assets are used for the common good rather than for the personal enrichment of a few entitled heirs. The transition from the Sterling estate to this 1,200 square foot condo was the most expensive move I ever made, not in terms of moving fees or real estate commissions, but in the cost of the illusions I had to leave behind. It was a price I would pay 1,000 times over to be able to look in the mirror and see a person who is no longer a clerical error. The final accounting of the Sterling family is a document that will be studied by law students and forensic specialists for decades, a perfect case study in how systemic fraud can be dismantled from the inside by a single person with access to the books and a commitment to the truth. But for me, The story ends not in a courtroom or a headline, but in a coffee shop next Tuesday morning. It ends with a handshake and a conversation with a man named Silas, a man who represents the 100% genetic reality that Harrison tried to bury under $1.4 million of stolen dreams. I am 34 years old. I am a forensic accountant, and I have finally learned that family isn't something you inherit. It's something you verify through the consistency of their actions and the honesty of their words. As the sun sets over Elliott Bay, turning the water into a sheet of hammered silver, I close my eyes and breathe in the cold, clean air of a life that is finally, irrevocably, in balance. The audit is closed, the truth has been served, and as I walk toward the kitchen to make a final cup of tea before bed, I know that I am exactly where I was always meant to be. No longer an investment, no longer an error, but a woman who has finally found her own name.